Hey there, and welcome to this demonstration on the Xenon app. Today what we're going to be looking at is how to take a Figma file that was designed perhaps by someone else and they didn't take into account organization and auto layouts that are really going to benefit you when utilizing Xenon. So as you can see here on your screen, what I have is a Figma mockup for a header, footer, and a home page. And what I'm going to do is group all of this content so we get the best possible results in Xenon. Right now, if you went ahead and added everything, you would have a lot of disorganized content. Nothing would be grouped together in logical ways, but what we're going to do is fix that in a relatively short period of time. This video is also useful for you to understand how to format your websites in the future using Figma, so you don't have to do this after the fact. So the first thing for you to keep in mind is that frames are going to be kind of a fundamental organizational component. They become divs in Oxygen, and that's how Xenon picks up on organization is based on frames. Not only that, but frames also let us take advantage of auto layouts, which is going to be a huge component of saving your time in Oxygen. One huge benefit of frames is that you can go ahead and drag a frame over a section of existing content and it will scoop up everything inside of it. So now I essentially have a header frame, minus of course the fact that my padding's a little bit off, but it's gone ahead and grabbed my button, all of my menu links here, and my logo for me automatically. So if I hid that, then you can see kind of what's inside of it. So it's a really good idea for you to go ahead and rename these frames and groups. So I'm going to just simply call this one header. And the reason why is because in Xenon, I'll quickly shift over here, you can see what they're labeled. So if you don't already have names on them, then it becomes a little bit confusing to understand, what is this frame? What is this label? So we'll go ahead and shift back over here to Figma. Now what I'm going to do is on this header frame that we just created, I'm going to enable an auto layout. And you can see things have changed already. So of course my padding is a little bit off from where it was, but that's okay. We can fix that pretty easily. Now we have a couple of things to consider. So this auto layout became horizontal by default, but we also have the vertical and horizontal option here. So these are pretty fundamental controls for you to understand. And these map directly into Oxygen as both vertical and horizontal layout for your Flex containers. Next up, we have the spacing between items here, which is 109 pixels. It just kind of detected the space and made everything fit. But if I wanted, I could change this to 50 and so on. It basically just made it fit so that that container was there. Now, what's going to happen here as it maps to Oxygen is the space between items. If your auto layout is set to horizontal, then it's going to apply 50 pixels of left margin to every element in the container except the first one. If it's set to a vertical direction, then it's going to add 50 pixels of top margin to everything except the first container. Now, of course, in this case, we do want it to be horizontal. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this all the way out. And then I want a little bit more grouping here because what I actually want to do is use space between in this case, but I don't want that much space between all of my text elements. So what we can do is just basically select these four, right click, and you can say group or frame. It doesn't really make a big difference. They're both just as capable as each other. So now we have this group. We're going to call these menu links. I actually am going to go ahead and apply an auto layout to this one. I want horizontal, and then I'm going to shrink the space between them to maybe something like 50 pixels. Depending on how your layout is set up, so you might even consider taking this button and getting it inside of your menu container as well. That's totally up to you. It's really going to depend on your layout and how you want everything to function in Oxygen. The Figma drag and drop can be a little bit clunky sometimes. It's hard to really know where it's actually going to end up. In that case, I did manage to get it. So now our button is inside of the container. One thing that's really important for you to note now, and we actually have a good example of this, is how Figma organizes its documents in a bottom to top configuration. So this first element here called home is actually at the bottom of this container. This behavior in the sidebar is exactly what's going to end up in Oxygen. So you're going to put your home link first, which is essentially the bottom of its container. And then the item that's going to be last will actually be first in its container. So that's a little bit confusing, but you'll definitely get used to that. And this is going to be really important later because what we're going to end up with is our header container here is actually going to end up at the bottom of our sidebar. And when we get down to our footer will actually be first in the sidebar. However, that is flipped when we get into Oxygen. So despite the fact that here in Figma, your header will be at the bottom, it will actually begin at the top in Oxygen. You'll see an example of that in another video when we take this layout into Oxygen. So let's go ahead and take our auto layout a little bit further here. So now we have a menu link container and we have our logo here, but what I want to do is middle align this content. So what I can do is actually come over here with this alignment and spacing controls. I'm going to go ahead and set this to middle align, and you can actually see the content is adjusting here. This container padding you can adjust if you want. This is of course our whole header container, so it probably makes sense for us to just go ahead and leave it at what Figma already detected for us. And there's still a little bit of alignment wonkiness, but we can fix that by going to our menu link here and doing the exact same thing. So now we're going to center this. You can kind of see how it's adjusting in these containers. Now again, the spacing between these links is actually coming from this right here. So if you wanted more or less, this space between items on this container of menu links is what's dictating that. Now moving back to our header container real quick, what I want to make sure we have set is space between, because I don't necessarily want packed because it's going to rely on this 50 pixels of space. Now, one thing that's important to note is that this 50 pixels of left margin is actually still going to exist on this container if you switch it over here to space between. So if you intend to use space between, switch back over to packed and make sure this auto layout is set to 0, and then you can turn space between back on. It's something that you would never see, but once you get into Oxygen, you would have to remove that. So it's better to just go ahead and do it now. Okay, so there is our header pretty much situated. Now we can go ahead and take another frame. I'm going to start from the bottom here, and you'll see why in a second. If I grab all of this content, then eventually I'm going to get markers. You can see it right there, which is where my header container ends. So now this actually grabbed everything inside of that container, one of which is a vector image, and it has a ton of different elements. Now, of course, you're not going to use a vector image on your real site. So what will happen is Xenon is actually going to ignore all of these vectors and instead put one image placeholder in Oxygen. There isn't a way to automatically pull the images over, so you will want to go ahead and use the export functionality here. Typically, you would go 2x PNG and then export that image and go ahead and upload that to your WordPress media library. Now, in our case, we're going to do a little bit more organization here. So let's go ahead and rename this. We'll call this Hero. And we essentially have a left and right sidebar here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and just select these items. I'm holding Shift here. Then I'm going to right click and say Group Selection. There's also a Control G shortcut if you want, but you don't necessarily have to do that. Then I want to do a couple of things. So first of all, on this left side container, I do want to go ahead and apply an auto layout. And what it does is automatically set the space between these items that already existed. So if you don't want an odd number like 27, may consider going like 25 or 30. And now what's going to happen is you're going to get 30 pixels of top margin on this button and 30 pixels of top margin on this text right here, but not on your heading. Then in this case, we have a hero graphic here on the right-hand side. So this is going to act as its own div. In this case, there will be another div and an image placeholder inside of it. That's just the nature of vectors, and that will work just fine. So we have kind of a div for our container here. So this section is pretty much done. The only thing worth mentioning is that you might as well go ahead and apply an auto layout. Set that to a horizontal direction, and then depending on your alignment, you would want to configure these controls right here. So there we go. You can see these aren't pushing all the way to the edges until I drag it there, but this won't make a huge difference in Oxygen because you want to actually set this container's width utilizing Oxygen, and often I'll do that with a class called like max width or something like that. We can add classes automatically later too once we get into Xenon. Okay, so we have our second section of the website situated there now as well. So we can go ahead and move down to the third one. This one is actually going to take quite a bit of manipulation because of this arrangement right here. So this is a great example. Once again, what I'm going to do is go ahead and use this frame. And actually, before I do that, let me get rid of that one. You can see right here, we're using a rectangle as a shape, which is okay, but rectangles don't map to anything in Oxygen. So the easiest way to fix this is we want to go to Frame. We're going to drag this over our white container. Then we can go ahead and add an auto layout. And what it does is get rid of that rectangle and gives the frame its properties. So in that case, it just had a fill of white like that. Now, of course, this really does mess up our layout. So I'm going to Control Z real quick and back up, and we'll come back to the auto layout in a little bit. So what I need to do at this point is go ahead and take this icon, this text, and do Control G for group. This icon and this text, Control G. This icon, this text, Control G, and one more time. So now I have 4 different groups. So I'll call this one Assurance. You don't necessarily have to rename these, but I do like to do it. Edit is what I wanted there. And then I'll just call this one Files, and this one we'll just call Clock. So now what I'm going to do is take all 4 of these that I just created, group those again. Then there's going to be 2 of them on the left side, which is our Assurance and our Files actually. So Control click to select those, group those 2, and then our Edit and our Clock, we're going to Control G those to group them again as well. So we'll call this one right side, and then this one will be left side. We'll call this one our features container. And then now we can go ahead and group this content on the left. So this one is going to be basically all of this stuff. And once again, we're going to Control G, and then we'll call this one left side. So now this is going to look a whole lot better once we go ahead and add the auto layout to this section right here. I think I'll just call this one features section, pretty close to my other name, but it's self-explanatory enough. Now I'll go ahead and add my auto layout, and you can see it's far easier now to control the layout now that I have everything grouped. So at this point, what I'm going to do is, instead of this 22 pixels, I think I'm going to change this to space between. We'll go ahead and extend this a little bit. And then let's see how big our features container is here. I wanted to make sure that it wasn't overflowing, but I think what's actually happening here is we have a lot of padding on the right side. So if we shrunk that down to like 125 on the left and right, you can kind of see the space between is being honored. So you could change that however you'd like. I think I'll go back to what padding was already there. And because we're using 175, I'm going to change these to 75 too. Just a small little difference, but those things do matter. Now again, you can change the layout if you wanted to, but in this case, I'm going to leave it top center aligned like that. The other thing worth noting is we probably want to go ahead and on this features container, set auto layout horizontal, which is good. I'm going to change this to space between, which isn't going to make a huge difference, but it could in Oxygen. Then on our right side, we're going to go with auto layout and vertical. And then the same thing on our left side, we're going to go auto layout and vertical. If you don't do that, then what you're going to find in Oxygen, like let's say we grab this features container and we didn't give this an auto layout, then all of these divs are going to be stacked on top of each other. So giving these auto layouts is going to help you a lot and make this design look more consistent when you finally bring it into Oxygen. So this section is pretty much situated now as well. So this is where I was talking about earlier, where our header is first, our hero is second, and our features is third, but the features is actually at the top of the sidebar there. Now, so this section is probably going to be pretty complicated because you can see it's pretty tall here. So we're going to have one container that essentially covers everything from that number 4 somewhere down here all the way up to that line right there. We'll have one container here. We'll probably do another one for each one of these rows. So this won't be too complicated, but definitely a good demonstration. Then we'll have a section for our plans here. So there'll be a couple nested divs inside of that. We'll have one for our footer that's going to contain both of these rows, and then we'll be pretty much good to go. So we'll try to move through this pretty fast here. So I'm going to take this and scroll down to about right there, should be fine. And now, of course, we have a ton of stuff inside this section. So let's go ahead and just work our way from the top down. I want to deselect that. And actually, I'm going to rename this. So how it works. Then I'll grab this text and this text, Control G, group that. Then I'm going to grab all of this stuff here, including this line and this, Control G that, and we'll call this one step 1 and not step 1P36, just step 1. Okay, so then we need to go grab this other stuff. I'm just holding Shift and clicking these items. So I'll just do these quickly. Then we have number 4 and that group, and that should be this one pretty much situated. So this one is step 2. This one is step 3. This one is step 4. And then how it works is actually at the top. So what we would want to do is push this one all the way down to the bottom. And in our Figma design, it actually doesn't change its position. But in Oxygen, it would be this one first, then here, boom, boom, boom. So you get the idea on that. Okay, so now we can go on our how it works section, give this one an auto layout of vertical. I want to center this. I want this to have a lot more padding than it did before. I don't remember the exact number. Looked like it was even more than that. 125 top and bottom is what we're going to go with. Now we're going to take these steps and essentially do the same thing. So auto layout, horizontal, and middle align. And it actually looks like we need one more group here. So this one and this line need to be grouped, and those need to have an auto layout of vertical, and then we're going to center that content right there. So before I do that over here, I'm going to take these two, group them, auto layout, and center like that. Then on this step 2 container, I'm going to give that an auto layout and center here. Now, of course, our content isn't lined up here. So let me see if I extend this container to be the equal width. So it's taken me a second to understand what's happening here. So these images are the same width. These are both 450 pixels wide, but this container is only 360. So what ends up happening is the widths are different. So in Oxygen, I would probably just resize these images. Not going to worry about it right now, but we'll get this looking pretty close. So again, I'm going to do the same thing to group the 3rd and 4th container here. Then on step 3, I'll give that an auto layout of horizontal and middle. And then last but not least, we're going to take the fourth, group that. And then we want step 4 to also have a horizontal layout and middle align that also. Now, obviously our lines are off, but we can fix that, like I said, just by changing the widths of these containers. One thing worth mentioning as well is that you can take these frames and divs, and under this resizing panel, you can change this to fill container, which is actually going to push this to the full edges and set this to 100% width in Oxygen. Hug Contents doesn't give it a width, and you can just define that later once you get in Oxygen. Okay, so we have our how it works section. That one is grouped together. And now we're going to do our plan section here. So we'll just go ahead and frame this up. We're going to take this all the way to about right there. And it looks like we didn't leave a whole lot of space above this, but that's okay. You guessed it, we're going to group these together. So Control G on those two. Then what I'm going to do is the contents inside of this I'm going to group. So now, of course, we have this container around our group, but it's not the whole element here. We have this rectangle, and that is not going to help us because, of course, you don't have auto layout controls on a rectangle. So what I want to do is grab my other group, the one I just created. I'm going to select that rectangle here, Control G to group it. And now what's going to happen is it pushes the rectangle inside. But if I have group 39 selected, which is my light plan there, then I can go ahead and add an auto layout. And what you can see is the rectangle is kind of absorbed into that new container that we made, and all of its properties will carry over, which is really nice. Now, despite the fact that this really doesn't make a difference because we only have one child of this container, we do actually want to set this to an auto layout of vertical and then go ahead and zero out the padding there, because otherwise you're going to have 10 pixels of space on top of these containers, which of course you don't want. Now, inside of this group 38, it will make sense for us to go ahead and add an auto layout of vertical here. We want to center this. And then there's 31 pixels of top margin to everything. I'm just going to change that to 30, make it a nice round number. So same thing over here. We're going to hold shift, click on all of these elements, and there's quite a few right here. Then grab this button, Control G. Now I have my group 38, which is going to be our basic plan. Then I'm going to hold shift again to select my rectangle, Control G. Once again, we can watch this rectangle get absorbed by adding an auto layout. Change this auto to a vertical direction. Zero out the space on the top. We'll go with center. Then on our basic plan, once again, auto layout vertical. We will keep the padding in this case, and then we'll just center everything like that. We did actually have these text items aligned together, which you can see right there. So I'll go Control G, auto layout, and we're going to change that one to horizontal. Space between is going to be 0, and then we're going to bottom align that. We'll fix this other alignment here in just a moment, but I want to do the same thing over here. Connect these, grab all of this stuff, Control G. Then we're going to grab our rectangle, Control G. Auto layout, I'm going to rename this one Pro. And it looks like our /month got abandoned. So we want to expand this and get it down into the right spot. So where are we right here? Okay, so there's our 20 and our month. Going to group those together. These will be auto layout, horizontal, 0 space, and maybe actually it does need a little bit of space, maybe 5, and once again, bottom align. So I'm going to do the same thing on this group here, add 5 pixels. So don't forget to go ahead and apply the auto layout to this frame here. We're going to center that, and then I'm going to figure out why this one is a little bit different height. I also want to take note of the fact that this arrangement here is not going to result in the correct orientation in Oxygen. So our light plan is first, so that's going to come down to the bottom, then our basic plan, and then our pro. So now that's fixed. Then group 37 is at the bottom as well. And we actually need to contain these one more time. So we're going to group this selection. We'll call this one our plan container. Then we'll call this one our choose plan text. And I want to, on this frame here, I'll call this our plan pricing or something like that, just to give it a somewhat unique name. I'm going to go to auto layout, vertical, and center. Instead of 69 hut, I'm going to change this to 70. And let's also give this some more padding on top. So we did something like 50 before, and then 50 on the bottom. Pretty close. Maybe it was 60 bottom and 60 top. You can see the container is pushing to the edges at the bottom. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now let's check and see why our alignment here is not quite right. Okay, so I just realized that these inner containers all have different space betweens. So that one's set to 30. This one right here is set to 20. So we'll change that to 30. And then this one is slightly off as well. That one is also going to go to 30. And now they're all aligned properly for the most part. It's all it's almost right. Okay, that's good enough for now. And then last but not least, we have our footer, which is of course going to take a couple of frames here for us to accomplish this. Nothing too crazy, which is what you'd have to do in Oxygen anyway. So we're going to take a new frame here and actually take it up from the bottom. I find starting from the bottom and up is the easiest, so you don't accidentally stick your frame in the wrong spot. So we'll call this one footer. Then we're going to take our logo here, our text, and these two icons. We'll group those together. And then there's a little bit more grouping that needs to happen. So these text links also need to get their own group. We'll call this one footer menu. We have our logo icon here, so that works. And then our social icons is already named. We'll call this container footer top row. Then we need to take this rectangle and this copyright text, Control G to group that together. I'll set this to an auto layout of vertical, and that is pretty much set now. So we don't actually need the 518 pixels here, so I'm going to zero these out. And then we can just basically drag this over. This container is not actually going to be full width in Oxygen, so you would need to add like a max width class or 100% width or something like that. But we can just center it like this, and that is going to be good enough. So we'll call this one bottom row. Then let's take a look at what this rectangle is. So this rectangle is actually the container for our footer top row. So what I'm going to do is minimize this and Control G group these together. And then again, I'll add an auto layout here. So now you can see our container is kind of absorbed inside of this. Vertical layout is fine because we only have one child in there. And then I'm going to center this just for continuity's sake. Now inside of our footer top row, let's go ahead and add an auto layout of horizontal. I am going to remove this 180% and instead change this to space between. And I'll take this container all the way to the edges and I'll make this wider. And you can see that it is filling out the space like that. Now, again, you could change this to fill container, and that will set this to 100% width in Oxygen. You might also want to go ahead and make this middle align like that. And now our footer top row is pretty much done. We have an auto layout on the social icons already. Our footer menu would need auto layout of horizontal. 40 pixels is good, and I will go center this vertically and horizontally. And that is pretty much good. So now our footer is situated, we have our plans, and you can see our sidebar is much cleaner here. Last but not least, on this footer, we do need to apply an auto layout, which is just vertical. We need a 0 pixel space between these. And then I personally just like to go ahead and center them, even though it's not actually going to make that big of a difference right now because the alignment is controlled by these two rows. I'll rename this one top row as well. And there we go. So now our document is pretty much cleaned up. We have a header, our hero, our features section, how it works, which of course will take a little bit more adjustment in Oxygen to fix. Then we have our plan page and then our footer. So that is how to clean up your document. This does take a little bit of time, but now that you know how to do this, it should start to fly for you really quickly. And also whoever your designer is, whether that's you or somebody else, you want to make sure that they're taking advantage of auto layouts and grouping this stuff properly because it's going to save everybody time in the long run. So I hope this video was helpful for you. In the next video, what we're going to do is actually get this into Oxygen using Xenon. You can find a link to that video and more information in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.